At my wedding, everyone was smiling. Everyone except my parents. They walked into the venue wearing black. Not elegant black. Not formal black. The kind of black people wear to funerals. My mother in a long dark dress. My father in a black suit and black tie, like he was attending a memorial service instead of his daughter's wedding. And the moment they stepped through the doors, people noticed. I remember the whispers first. Soft voices near the entrance. A few confused looks from my husband's relatives. Someone even asked quietly, "Did something happen?" I stood near the front of the garden aisle, holding my bouquet, pretending not to notice. Because sometimes pretending is easier. I'm glad you're here, by the way. Stay with me until the end of this story. And if you want, tell me the city you're watching from. I always like seeing how far these stories travel. But at that moment, I wasn't thinking about stories. I was thinking about my parents. And how they had walked into my wedding looking like they were attending my funeral. The ceremony was being held in a small vineyard outside Napa. Late afternoon sunlight. White chairs set up between the rows of vines. Soft music playing from a string quartet near the arbor. Everything looked exactly the way I had imagined it. Except for them. My mother didn't smile when she saw me. She didn't wave. She didn't hug me. She simply sat down in the second row next to my father. Her face perfectly calm. My younger sister sat beside them. Unlike my parents, she was smiling. Actually, smiling isn't the right word. She looked entertained. Like she was waiting for something. I noticed that right away. But the music started before I could think about it too much. And then the ceremony began. My husband Daniel stood waiting at the altar. The moment I looked at him, the tension in my chest eased a little. He smiled the way he always does when he wants to remind me everything is going to be okay. Daniel had met my parents only 4 times before the wedding. 4 times had been enough. He knew what they were like. But he also knew something else. Today wasn't about them. The ceremony itself was beautiful. Simple. Quiet. The kind of wedding where people actually listen to the vows instead of checking their phones. Daniel held my hands the entire time. And when we said, "I do," the guests applauded warmly. For a few minutes, everything felt perfect. My parents didn't clap. But I tried not to notice that. The reception was held just inside the vineyard house. Long wooden tables. Candles. Soft jazz playing through the speakers. My husband's parents were laughing with our friends near the bar. My college roommate was already halfway through a glass of champagne. It looked like a real wedding again. Normal. Happy. The kind of evening people remember fondly years later. I almost allowed myself to relax. Almost. But then I noticed my mother standing up. She wasn't heading toward the buffet. Or the dance floor. She was walking toward the microphone stand near the DJ table. First, I assumed she wanted to give a speech. That's normal at weddings. Parents thank the guests. Share a few embarrassing childhood stories. Maybe cry a little. But my mother didn't look emotional. She looked focused. My father stood up too. So did my sister. 3 black silhouettes moving through a room full of white dresses and champagne glasses. The DJ stepped aside politely as my mother reached the microphone. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't tap the mic. She simply started speaking. And the room quieted almost immediately. "My daughter," she said. Her voice was calm. Clear. But there was something strange about the tone. Something cold. "I'm glad everyone is here today." A few guests nodded politely. My husband's mother smiled warmly from her table. But my mother didn't smile back. She looked directly at me. Then she said something that turned the entire room silent. "We will stay right here," she said slowly, "until you sign the house over to your sister." For a moment no one reacted. Because people thought they had misheard. A wedding reception is the last place anyone expects to hear a sentence like that. My sister laughed softly behind her. Actually laughed. And my father folded his arms like this was a conversation that had been waiting to happen. 40 guests. 1 microphone. And suddenly my wedding had turned into something else. I didn't say anything. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. Instead I looked at my husband. Because Daniel had been waiting for this moment. And when my mother finished her sentence, he slowly stood up from his chair. Then he turned toward the large screen behind the DJ booth. And calmly said 5 words that changed everything. Go ahead and play it. For a few seconds after my mother said it, no one moved. We will stay right here until you sign the house over to your sister. The sentence just sat there in the air. Like the music had stopped in the middle of a song. Guests looked at each other. A few people laughed nervously, assuming it had to be some kind of strange joke. Because no one expects a property demand in the middle of a wedding reception. My husband Daniel was still standing beside me. His hand had tightened slightly around mine. Across the room, my sister leaned against one of the wooden posts near the dance floor. She looked amused. Not embarrassed. Not shocked. Amused. Like she had been waiting for exactly this moment. My father stood behind my mother with his arms folded, watching the room carefully. My mother still held the microphone. She didn't smile. She didn't explain. She just waited. 40 guests sat at the reception tables under the vineyard lights. Wine glasses half full. Dinner plates barely touched. And suddenly the room wasn't a wedding anymore. It was something else. I'm glad you're still here, by the way. Stories like this are strange because they always look different from the inside. If you want, tell me where you're watching from. I like knowing how far these moments travel. But at that moment I wasn't thinking about the audience. I was thinking about my house. The small 2-bedroom place Daniel and I had bought the year before. Not a mansion. Not some huge inheritance. Just a simple house we had saved for. And somehow my mother had turned it into the centerpiece of my wedding speech. My cousin at the far table whispered to his wife. What house? Someone else murmured. Did she just say sign something? My husband's father looked confused. My husband's mother looked horrified. My mother tapped the microphone once, like she wanted to make sure everyone was listening clearly. I'm not trying to ruin the celebration, she said calmly, which was a strange sentence to say after ruining the celebration. But this is important. The room stayed quiet. She continued. That house belongs to this family. My sister laughed again. A short, sharp laugh that echoed louder than the microphone. My mother pointed toward her. Your sister deserves stability. Then she pointed toward me. And you have always been selfish with what the family built. The accusation landed hard. But I didn't react. Not outwardly. Because I had heard variations of that sentence my entire life. Selfish. Ungrateful. Difficult. Daniel squeezed my hand slightly. He knew that history. He had heard the stories before the wedding. But hearing them through a microphone in front of 40 people was something different. My father finally spoke. His voice carried easily even without the mic. We're not leaving until this is resolved. The sentence sounded like a contract clause. Not a family conversation. A few guests shifted in their chairs. Someone at the back muttered, "This is unbelievable." My mother lowered the microphone slightly and looked directly at me. You know exactly what we're asking. I did. They had asked before. Many times. My sister wanted the house. Not because she couldn't afford one, but because my parents believed she deserved it more. She had stayed near them. Worked part-time at my father's office. Followed every family expectation. I had moved away. Built my own career. And apparently that meant anything I owned was still negotiable. Daniel finally stepped forward. Not aggressively. Just calmly. Excuse me, he said. My mother glanced at him briefly. This is a family matter. Daniel nodded. Yes. Another pause. But you're discussing my house. That sentence made a few guests murmur quietly. Because technically, it was true. Daniel and I had purchased the house together. His name was on the deed. My mother lifted the microphone again. We're asking your wife to do the right thing. My sister crossed her arms and smiled. She knows what that means. I looked around the room. At the guests. At the tables. At the wedding decorations Daniel and I had spent months planning. White flowers. Soft lights. Music that had stopped playing 10 minutes earlier. My wedding day. Now turned into a public negotiation. My husband's best friend leaned toward the DJ booth. Should we cut the mic? He whispered. But the DJ didn't move. No one knew what to do. Because situations like this don't exist in normal wedding etiquette guides. My father took a step closer to the center of the room. You've always owed this family, he said. And today is the perfect moment to make things right. The sentence echoed across the vineyard hall. Several guests looked at me, waiting, expecting a response, an argument, maybe even tears. But I didn't say anything. Instead, I did the one thing my parents hadn't expected. I turned and looked at Daniel. He nodded slightly, like we had rehearsed something, which in a way we had, because 2 weeks earlier, we had already heard them planning this exact moment. Daniel stepped away from the table. He walked calmly toward the DJ booth. The large projection screen behind the dance floor flickered slightly as he picked up the remote. My mother frowned. "What are you doing?" Daniel didn't answer. He simply pointed toward the screen, then looked back at the room, and said quietly, "Before anyone signs anything, I think everyone here deserves to see something." When Daniel said that, the entire room turned toward the screen. The large white projection screen behind the dance floor had been set up for the usual wedding slideshow. Photos from our relationship, vacation pictures, maybe a few embarrassing childhood photos, the kind of thing guests smile at while finishing their dessert. That was the plan. But the screen wasn't showing a slideshow. Not yet. Daniel stood beside the DJ booth holding the remote. He didn't look angry. He didn't raise his voice. If anything, he looked calmer than anyone else in the room. My mother frowned into the microphone. "What exactly do you think you're doing?" Daniel glanced at her briefly, making sure everyone understands the situation. My father stepped forward. "This isn't necessary." Daniel nodded once. "That depends." A few guests shifted in their chairs. Someone near the back whispered, "What's going on?" The screen flickered. Then it turned black. For a moment nothing appeared. Just a blank surface glowing softly under the vineyard lights. Daniel looked around the room. 2 weeks ago, he said, we had dinner with my wife's parents. My mother's expression changed slightly. My sister stopped smiling. The room stayed quiet. We were discussing the wedding, Daniel continued. Logistics, seating, the ceremony schedule. Everything sounded normal, until he added, and during that conversation, something interesting came up. My father took a step forward. "You're not seriously going to..." Daniel pressed the button on the remote. The screen lit up. Not with pictures, with video. The angle was slightly tilted like the camera had been placed casually on a table. The image showed my parents' dining room. My mother sitting at the head of the table. My father beside her. My sister leaning back in her chair with a glass of wine. A date and timestamp appeared in the corner. 2 weeks earlier. The room at the wedding reception went completely silent. Someone near the bar whispered, "Is that?" Yes, it was exactly what they thought. Daniel had recorded that dinner. Not secretly. Not hidden. The phone had been sitting on the table between us the entire time. My mother's voice came through the speakers. Clear. Calm. "We need to address the house before the wedding." A few guests shifted in their chairs. My sister laughed on the video. "Why before?" My father answered, "Because once the wedding happens, she'll think everything is settled." The room absorbed that quietly. My husband's best friend leaned forward at his table. My cousin stopped halfway through a sip of wine. On the screen my mother continued, "The house should belong to your sister." My sister nodded in the video. Obviously. Then she added something that made several guests glance toward her at the reception. "She doesn't even appreciate what she has." At the wedding my sister's smile disappeared. On the screen my father leaned back in his chair. "That's why the wedding is the perfect time." A pause. Public pressure. Someone near the dance floor whispered, "Oh my God." My father's voice continued through the speakers. "She won't argue in front of everyone." My mother nodded slowly. "And if she refuses?" Another pause. "We simply stay." At the reception, several guests turned their heads toward my mother. The microphone was still in her hand, but she wasn't speaking anymore. On the video my sister laughed again. Can you imagine her face? She raised her glass slightly. "She'll cave." Back in the vineyard hall, the silence felt heavier. Because everyone in the room had just heard something important. This wasn't a spontaneous confrontation. It was planned. My father stepped forward. "Turn that off." Daniel didn't move. "It's almost finished." My mother finally lowered the microphone. "This is completely inappropriate." Daniel looked at her. So was the speech. A few guests shifted again. Someone at the far table quietly set down their fork. On the screen, my mother's voice spoke again. We wear black. The room reacted immediately. Several people glanced at my parents' clothing. My sister looked at the floor. My father looked furious. Why black? My sister asked in the video. My mother answered simply. To make a point. Then she smiled slightly. Funerals get attention. The screen froze. Daniel paused the video. The room sat in stunned silence. 40 wedding guests. White tablecloths. Candles flickering along the tables. And the realization that my parents hadn't just come to the wedding in black. They had planned it. My father pointed at the screen. This proves nothing. Daniel calmly set the remote down. It proves quite a lot. My mother looked at me for the first time since the video began. Her voice was tight. You set this up. I shook my head. No, Daniel answered for me. You did. Another pause. Then he gestured toward the screen again. And we simply recorded it. For several seconds after the video paused, the room didn't move. The vineyard reception hall had gone completely silent. Not the quiet from earlier when people were confused. This silence was different. Now everyone understood what they had just seen. 40 guests sat around the tables under the hanging lights, staring at the screen where my parents' dining room was still frozen in the frame. My mother smiling slightly. My sister raising her wine glass. My father leaning back in his chair, planning my wedding like it was a negotiation. Someone near the back whispered softly, "Did they really say that?" Another guest murmured, "They planned the whole thing." My mother finally spoke again. Her voice had lost the calm confidence it had earlier. That video is taken completely out of context. The microphone was still in her hand, but she wasn't speaking into it anymore. She sounded smaller now. Daniel stepped away from the DJ booth and walked back toward the center of the room. Out of context? He asked calmly. My father looked furious. You recorded a private family dinner. Daniel nodded. Yes. My father pointed toward the screen. That conversation wasn't meant for an audience. Daniel glanced around the reception hall. 40 people. White tablecloths. Wedding flowers. My parents still dressed in black. Then he said quietly, "Neither was your speech." A few guests shifted in their seats. Someone near the bar muttered, "He's got a point." My sister suddenly stood up. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. Her earlier amusement had vanished. "You set us up." I shook my head slowly. No, her eyes narrowed. "You knew we wanted the house." "Yes," I said. "But I didn't expect you to announce it during my wedding." That sentence made several guests nod slightly, because now the timeline was clear. My parents had planned the confrontation, planned the clothing, planned the pressure. And now the plan had been exposed in front of everyone. My father stepped forward again. His voice was louder this time. "This is still a family matter." Richard, Daniel's uncle, finally spoke from the table near the center of the room. "I'm not sure it is anymore." Everyone turned toward him. He wasn't angry, just calm. "When you use a microphone in front of 40 guests," he continued, "you make it everyone's business." A few people quietly agreed. My mother tightened her grip on the microphone. "You're all misunderstanding what happened." My sister laughed bitterly. "Oh, please." Then she pointed toward me. "She's acting like a victim." The word hung in the air. Victim. My father nodded slightly. "You've always dramatized things." I felt Daniel's hand rest lightly on my back. Steady. Supportive. But I still hadn't spoken much. Because something interesting was happening in the room. People were starting to look at my parents differently. Earlier they had assumed I was the problem. Now they were seeing something else. Daniel's mother spoke gently from her table. "You asked her to sign over her home." My mother lifted her chin. "We asked her to support her sister." My sister crossed her arms. "She doesn't even need that house." Someone near the back whispered, "That's not really the point." The whisper spread through the room like a ripple, because everyone understood the real issue. Not the house. The timing. The pressure. The public humiliation. My father looked around the room again, realizing the atmosphere had shifted. This is being blown out of proportion, he said. Daniel picked up the remote again. No, he replied. It isn't. The screen behind him flickered once more. My mother's voice sharpened. What are you doing now? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He pressed the button. The video resumed. The same dining room. The same dinner table. But now the conversation had moved further. On the screen my sister leaned forward with a grin. What if she refuses? My father answered without hesitation. Then we make it uncomfortable. A few guests inhaled quietly. The room listened. My mother spoke next. She hates scenes. Another pause. That's why the wedding is perfect. The screen froze again. Daniel lowered the remote slowly. And now the room didn't just look uncomfortable. It looked shocked. Because everyone had heard the real strategy. Not a family request. A public ambush. My father pointed angrily at the screen. This is manipulation. Daniel looked directly at him. No, he said calmly. It's documentation. My sister grabbed her purse from the chair. This is insane. My mother looked at me again. Her expression had changed. Less confident. More calculating. You've embarrassed this family enough for one day. I finally spoke. My voice sounded quieter than the microphone had earlier. But everyone still heard it. You came to my wedding dress for a funeral. The room stayed silent. And you tried to take my house in front of everyone I love. I paused. Then added softly, if anyone embarrassed this family today. I glanced toward the screen behind Daniel. It wasn't me. And for the first time that evening, my parents didn't have a response. For a moment after I said that, the room didn't move. Not a chair. Not a glass. Not even the music, which had been quietly playing through the speakers earlier. Someone at the DJ booth had turned it off without anyone noticing. The screen behind Daniel still showed the frozen image of my parents' dining room. My mother leaning forward. My father speaking calmly. My sister smiling like the whole thing was entertainment. The proof was still hanging in the air. And now the room felt different. Earlier that evening the attention had been focused on me. The bride. The daughter who was supposedly selfish. The woman who needed to be corrected. But now the attention had shifted. 40 guests weren't looking at me anymore. They were looking at my parents. My father finally broke the silence. This is a private conversation taken completely out of context. He sounded more defensive than confident now. Daniel didn't argue. He simply gestured toward the screen. You planned the confrontation, he said. My mother lifted the microphone again. You're twisting things. Several guests exchanged glances. Because the video had been very clear. My sister suddenly stepped forward. This is ridiculous, she snapped. Then she pointed at me. You knew we wanted the house. Yes, I said calmly. But I didn't know you planned to demand it at my wedding. My sister laughed again, but the sound felt weaker this time. You're acting like we attacked you. My husband's mother finally stood up. She had been quiet the entire evening. Watching. Listening. Now she spoke softly, but the room heard every word. You stood up in the middle of your daughter's wedding and demanded her home. The sentence was simple. But it changed something. My mother looked irritated. That house belongs to this family. Daniel answered immediately. No, he didn't raise his voice. It belongs to my wife and me. My father stepped closer. You married into this situation. Daniel nodded. That's true. Then he added something that made several guests shift in their chairs. But I didn't marry into your control. The sentence landed harder than anyone expected. My sister crossed her arms. She's always been dramatic. One of Daniel's cousins muttered quietly. This isn't drama. Another guest whispered. This is unbelievable. The room had started to divide. Not loudly. Not with arguments. Just small reactions. People choosing where to look. And they weren't looking at me anymore. My father noticed it too. His eyes moved around the room. Measuring the mood. Realizing the control he expected wasn't there. This entire situation is being exaggerated, he said. We're simply asking for fairness. Daniel tilted his head slightly. Fairness. My mother nodded. Your sister has always supported this family. My sister straightened proudly. Yes. Then she pointed toward me again. And you ran away. I let the silence sit for a moment, because that accusation had been used many times before. But tonight was different. Tonight there were witnesses. Daniel pressed the remote again. The screen behind him flickered once more. My mother immediately snapped, "Turn that off." Daniel didn't. The video continued. On the screen, my sister's voice spoke again from that dinner 2 weeks earlier. "What if she refuses to sign?" My father answered immediately. "She won't." The room listened carefully now. My mother's voice followed. "She hates confrontation." My sister laughed in the video. "So we make it public." Back in the reception hall, someone near the bar whispered, "That's exactly what they did." Another guest shook their head slowly. My father pointed angrily toward the screen. "This is manipulation." Daniel finally lowered the remote. "No," he said calmly. "This is transparency." The word hung in the air. Transparency. Because now everyone understood something important. This hadn't been a family conversation. It had been a plan. My mother stepped away from the microphone. Her voice was tight now. "You've made your point." Daniel nodded slightly. "Yes." Then he added something quietly. "But we're not finished yet." My sister scoffed. "Oh please." Daniel turned toward the screen again. "There's one more part everyone should hear." The room leaned forward slightly, because by now, every time the video played, something new appeared. My father's voice from the recording returned through the speakers. "If she refuses," a short pause. Then the rest of the sentence played. "We make it clear she doesn't belong in this family anymore." The words echoed through the reception hall. And suddenly the entire room understood what my parents had really come to do. Not just take my house, but erase me if I didn't give it to them. When the last sentence of the recording ended, the room stayed quiet. "We make it clear she doesn't belong in this family anymore." The words echoed softly through the Vineyard Hall before fading into silence. No music. No clinking glasses. Just 40 people sitting under warm string lights, staring at the screen behind Daniel. My father was the first to move. He stepped closer to the DJ booth, pointing toward the projection screen. "That's enough," he said sharply. Daniel didn't react. He stood calmly beside the table, the small remote still in his hand. My mother still held the microphone, but she hadn't spoken for several seconds now. Earlier she had sounded confident, certain. Now her expression looked different. Tight. Controlled. Like someone trying to regain control of a conversation that had already slipped away. My sister broke the silence. "This is ridiculous," she said loudly. Then she pointed at me. "You knew about this." Her voice wasn't accusing. It was almost impressed. I didn't answer immediately, because the truth was simple. "Yes," I said. "I did." The room reacted instantly. Several guests turned toward me. My father's eyebrows pulled together. "You're admitting that?" Daniel finally spoke. "We heard the recording 2 weeks ago." That sentence landed like another stone in the middle of the room. 2 weeks. That meant something important. This hadn't been a spontaneous response. My parents hadn't surprised you. My sister stared at Daniel. "You planned this?" Daniel shook his head. "No," he gestured lightly toward the screen. "They did." A quiet ripple moved through the room, because everyone understood the difference. My parents had planned the confrontation. Daniel had simply prepared the response. My mother stepped forward again. Her voice sounded colder now. "So you decided to humiliate us." Daniel answered calmly. "You decided to do that yourselves." Someone near the back whispered, "He's not wrong." My father ignored the comment. He looked directly at me. "You set your parents up." I shook my head slowly. "No," another pause. "You set yourselves up." The room stayed very still, because that sentence felt true in a way no one could easily argue with. My sister suddenly laughed again. But the sound didn't carry the same confidence it had earlier. "Wow," she said. "You really turned this into a performance." Daniel's best friend muttered quietly. "They started the show." My mother raised the microphone again. "This conversation is over." But the authority in her voice had faded. Earlier she had controlled the room. Now she was just another person standing in it. Daniel glanced toward the DJ booth. Then back at the guests. I think everyone deserves the full story. My father's voice snapped immediately. No, but Daniel continued. Because the video you saw was only the first part. That sentence changed the room again. Several guests leaned forward slightly. My sister's smile disappeared. My mother's eyes narrowed. What do you mean the first part? Daniel lifted the remote again. The conversation didn't end there. My father took a step toward him. You're not playing anything else. Daniel looked at him. I already did. The screen flickered. The frozen image shifted. And the video resumed. The same dining room. The same dinner table. My parents still sitting across from us. My sister still holding her wine glass. But the conversation had moved further. On the screen my sister leaned forward with a grin. Okay, she said. But what if she still refuses? My father answered immediately. She won't. My mother nodded beside him. People don't argue during their own wedding. The guests at the reception exchanged quiet looks. Because that line had just explained everything. The timing. The pressure. The microphone. The public demand. My sister laughed in the video. Yeah, she said. She hates scenes. Then she added the sentence that made several guests turn their heads slowly toward her in the reception hall. So we give her one she can't escape. The room stayed completely silent. Because the plan had just been spoken out loud. Not a misunderstanding. Not a family conversation. A strategy. My father reached toward the DJ table like he wanted to grab the laptop. Turn that off right now. Daniel calmly stepped between him and the equipment. No, my mother lowered the microphone slowly. This is harassment. Daniel shook his head. No, he looked around the room. This is clarity. Someone near the bar whispered quietly. They really planned the whole thing. Another guest nodded. My sister's face had gone pale now. That video doesn't prove anything. Daniel glanced toward the screen again. It proves enough. The video continued for a few more seconds. My mother's voice spoke again from the recording. We'll make it clear the house belongs to the family. Then my father added calmly, and if she refuses, he paused. Then finished the sentence. She's on her own. Daniel pressed the remote again. The screen went dark. And the room understood something all at once. This had never been about a house. It had been about control. When the screen went dark, the room stayed silent. Not the same silence from earlier when people were confused. This silence felt heavier. Because now everyone understood what had just happened. The video hadn't shown a misunderstanding. It had shown a plan. And that plan had been designed for this exact moment, my wedding reception. Daniel slowly lowered the remote in his hand. The projector light faded slightly against the blank screen behind him. My father stared at it like it had betrayed him. You're twisting a private conversation, he said. His voice sounded louder now, but it didn't carry the authority it had earlier. Because 40 guests had just watched the conversation themselves. Daniel didn't argue. He simply said, no. I'm finishing it. That sentence made several people lean forward slightly. Because everyone had noticed something during the video. The conversation had stopped suddenly. Like the story had been cut in the middle. My sister noticed it too. Her eyes moved from the screen to Daniel. You edited that, she said quickly. Daniel shook his head. No, then he looked around the room. We paused it. That was different. The room absorbed that quietly. My father stepped closer. There's nothing else to see. Daniel met his eyes. There is. My mother's voice cut in sharply. Don't you dare. But Daniel had already pressed the remote again. The screen flickered. And the recording resumed. The same dinner table. The same 4 people sitting there. But now the conversation had moved forward. On the screen my sister leaned back in her chair, still smiling. So what if she refuses? My father shrugged. Then he said something that made several guests shift in their seats. Then she chooses her husband over this family. My mother nodded beside him. And that tells us everything we need to know. Back in the vineyard hall, my mother's face had gone pale. Stop the video, she said. Daniel didn't move. On the screen my sister laughed. Well, at least we'll know where she stands. Then she added something quietly. And if she walks away? My father answered immediately. Then we let her. A pause. Because anyone who refuses this family isn't really part of it. The room listened carefully, because those words were calm, not angry, not emotional, just deliberate, like a rule that had already been decided. Daniel paused the video again. The projector light froze on my father's face from 2 weeks earlier. My father in the reception hall looked furious now. "You're done," he said. Daniel looked back at him. "No." Then he gestured lightly toward the screen. "You are." The room reacted quietly. Someone near the back whispered. "They were ready to cut her off." Another guest murmured. "All over a house." My sister snapped. "It's not just a house." Daniel turned toward her. "You're right." He let the sentence hang for a moment. Then he said the part everyone had started to realize. "It's about control." That word landed harder than anything else that night, because suddenly the entire story made sense. The demand, the microphone, the black clothing, the pressure. My father shook his head. "You don't understand our family." Richard, Daniel's uncle, spoke from his table again. "I think we do." My mother gripped the microphone tighter. This was supposed to stay inside the family. Daniel glanced around the reception hall. The candles. The wedding tables. The 40 witnesses. That option ended when you used the microphone. A few guests nodded quietly. My sister grabbed her purse again. "This is unbelievable." Then she pointed toward me. "You're letting him destroy this family." I finally answered her. "No." The room looked toward me again. "You did that yourselves." Another pause. Because now the room had watched the entire plan unfold. Not just tonight. 2 weeks earlier. My father grabbed his jacket from the back of his chair. "We're leaving." The sentence sounded final, but it didn't feel powerful. Felt like surrender. My mother looked at him, then at the guests, then at the screen still glowing faintly behind Daniel. She lowered the microphone slowly. "You've embarrassed us enough." Daniel answered quietly. "No." Then he added the truth everyone in the room had already realized. "You embarrassed yourselves." My sister turned toward the exit first. Her heels echoed sharply against the wooden floor. My father followed, still dressed in the black suit he had chosen for my wedding. My mother hesitated for 1 second longer. Then she placed the microphone on the DJ table and walked out behind them. The doors closed softly, and for the first time since the speech began, the room finally breathed again. For a moment after the doors closed behind them, no one moved. The Vineyard reception hall felt strangely still. My parents had walked out exactly the way they came in, dressed in black, silent. But the atmosphere they left behind was completely different from the one they entered. Earlier that evening, the room had been tense, confused, waiting for something awkward to resolve itself. Now the tension had shifted into something else. Relief. Daniel slowly set the remote down on the DJ table. The screen behind him had gone dark again, reflecting only the warm glow of the reception lights. For a few seconds no one said anything. Then someone near the back of the room let out a small breath and said quietly, "Well, that was something." A few people laughed nervously, not because anything was funny, but because everyone had been holding their breath for the past 10 minutes. Daniel's uncle Richard stood up from his chair. He looked toward the door my parents had just walked through, then back at me. "I'm sorry that happened at your wedding," he said gently. I nodded. "Me too." My husband's mother walked over next. She hugged me carefully like she was afraid I might break. "You handled that better than anyone could have," she said. I didn't feel strong. I didn't feel victorious. Mostly I felt tired, because the truth is none of this had surprised me. The demand for the house, the pressure, even the black clothing. All of it felt like something that had been building for years. Daniel stepped beside me again. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. Then I added honestly, "I think so." Around us, the guests were beginning to move again. Chairs shifted. Glasses lifted. Soft conversations started to return. But no one was pretending the last 15 minutes hadn't happened. A few people were still glancing toward the door, as if expecting my parents to come back inside. They didn't. My sister didn't return either. The three of them were gone. Daniel's best friend finally walked toward the DJ booth. "So, Do we play the first dance song or do we need another documentary first? He joked. That made the room laugh properly this time. The tension cracked. Daniel smiled for the first time since the speech. I think we're done with presentations, he said. The DJ nodded quickly. Got it. He tapped the laptop, and a soft song started playing again through the speakers. Not loud. Just enough to remind everyone this was still a wedding. But something interesting had changed. No one looked uncomfortable anymore. If anything, the room felt more united than before. Because everyone had watched the same moment together. Daniel turned to me and held out his hand. May I have the first dance? He asked. I looked at him for a second. Then I laughed softly. I think we're a little behind schedule. That's okay, he said. We've already had the most memorable speech. A few nearby guests chuckled. Someone raised a glass. To the bride and groom. The cheers spread quickly across the room. Glasses lifted. The tension dissolved a little more. Daniel led me toward the center of the dance floor. The same space where my mother had stood with the microphone 15 minutes earlier. Now the screen behind us was dark. The lights were warm again. The music filled the room gently. Daniel placed one hand at my waist. You knew this might happen, he said quietly. Yes. And you still wanted to go through with the wedding? I nodded. Because of you. That answer made him smile. The music continued. We started to dance slowly in the middle of the room. For the first time all evening, people began to relax. Again. My college friends clapped softly. Daniel's parents watched with warm smiles. Someone near the back wiped their eyes. Not because of the drama earlier, but because weddings still have a way of bringing emotion out of people. Halfway through the song, Daniel leaned closer and whispered something that made me laugh again. What? I asked. He grinned. I was just thinking. Your parents wore black to the wedding. Yes. And somehow they were still the least prepared people in the room. That made me laugh harder than anything else that night. Because he was right. My parents had come to the wedding expecting control. They had expected pressure. They had expected me to surrender quietly in front of everyone. Instead, the exact opposite happened. The plan they had built for weeks had collapsed in less than 10 minutes. And now the only people missing from the celebration were the ones who had tried to ruin it. As the song ended, the guests applauded. Not loudly. Just warmly. The way people clap when they're genuinely happy for someone. Daniel squeezed my hand again. Ready for the rest of the night? He asked. I looked around the room. At the friends. At the family who had stayed. At the tables full of people who had just watched something complicated unfold. And still chose to celebrate with us. Then I nodded. Yes, I said. Now we can finally have our wedding. After our first dance ended, the room slowly returned to life. Not the loud, chaotic kind of life that usually follows a wedding interruption. This was quieter. More thoughtful. Guests moved back toward their tables. Some picked up their glasses again. Others leaned toward each other, speaking in low voices. Because everyone had just witnessed something they would probably remember for years. Daniel and I stepped off the dance floor together. His hand was still holding mine. Not tightly. Just steady. The kind of steady that reminds you you're not standing alone anymore. My college friend Jenna walked over first. Her eyes were wide, but she was smiling. Okay, she said softly. That was the most dramatic wedding moment I've ever seen. I laughed. I was hoping for a quieter reception. Well, she shrugged. You definitely got memorable instead. Behind her, a few guests were still looking toward the door where my parents had left. Not because they expected them to return, but because people were still processing what they had seen. Richard walked over again holding 2 glasses of champagne. He handed one to Daniel. Your timing with that video was excellent, he said calmly. Daniel nodded slightly. I hoped we wouldn't need it. Richard raised an eyebrow. You brought it anyway. Daniel smiled faintly. Yes. That made a few people nearby chuckle. Because by now it was obvious. Daniel hadn't come unprepared. My mother-in-law joined us next. She placed a gentle hand on my arm. I want you to know something, she said. I looked at her. No one here believes what they said about you. Her words were quiet, but they carried weight. Because earlier that evening my parents had tried to paint a very different picture. A selfish daughter. A woman who abandoned her family. Someone who owed them everything. Now 40 witnesses had seen something else entirely. Across the room, 2 of my parents' distant cousins were speaking with Daniel's aunt. I could hear fragments of their conversation. I had no idea they were like that. They planned the whole thing? At a wedding? The disbelief in their voices felt genuine. Because most people still expect families to protect each other, not ambush each other. Daniel noticed where I was looking. "You okay?" he asked quietly. "Yes." Then I added honestly, "I just didn't think it would happen exactly like that." He nodded. I didn't either. A few feet away, the DJ was adjusting the music again. Soft background jazz began filling the room. Not loud enough for dancing yet. Just enough to smooth the atmosphere. Daniel's best friend Mark walked over holding a plate of wedding cake. "You two should probably eat something," he said. "You've been hosting a reality show for 20 minutes. That made Daniel laugh. "Is it that obvious?" Mark nodded. "Oh yeah." He looked around the room. Everyone's still talking about it. I followed his gaze. Several guests were gathered near the bar. Quiet conversations. Occasional glances toward the screen behind the dance floor. The screen that had changed everything. The DJ had already turned the projector off, but people still remembered what had played there. The plan. The recording. The truth. Jenna leaned closer to me. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." She lowered her voice slightly. "Did you always know your parents would go that far?" I thought about the question for a moment. Then I answered honestly. "No." Another pause. "But I knew they wouldn't stop asking." Daniel squeezed my hand slightly. And that was the part that mattered. Because tonight wasn't the beginning of the problem. It was the end of it. Across the room, Daniel's father raised his glass. "To the bride and groom." The cheers spread quickly through the hall. Glasses lifted. Applause followed. The atmosphere shifted again. Not completely back to normal, but close enough. Daniel looked at me. "You know something," he said. "What?" "I think the hardest part is over." I smiled. "I hope so." He glanced toward the door one more time. "They won't come back tonight." I know. And strangely, that didn't make me sad. It made the room feel lighter. Because the people who remained in that vineyard hall had made a choice. They stayed. They celebrated. They stood with us. The music grew a little louder. Someone started another round of applause. Mark nudged Daniel's shoulder. "Time for the next dance, man." Daniel looked at me. "Ready?" I took a breath and nodded. "Yes." Because the night wasn't ruined. Not anymore. The wedding was still happening. And for the first time all evening, finally felt like ours. The music picked up again after our second dance. Not loudly. Just enough to bring the room back to life. The DJ switched to something upbeat. And a few people finally moved toward the dance floor again. Glasses clinked. Laughter slowly returned. But the room wasn't pretending the last half hour hadn't happened. People were still talking about it. Not loudly. Just quiet conversations at the tables. Because what happened at a wedding like that becomes a story everyone carries home. Daniel and I stepped away from the dance floor again, catching our breath near the long table where the wedding cake was waiting. The candles were still burning softly along the centerpiece. Everything looked exactly like it had earlier that evening. Except the tension was gone. Daniel's father walked over first. He placed a hand on Daniel's shoulder. "That was handled well," he said simply. Daniel nodded. "I wish it hadn't been necessary." His father smiled faintly. "Sometimes the truth needs witnesses." That sentence stayed with me for a moment. Because that was exactly what tonight had become. 40 witnesses. Not to a confrontation, but to the truth behind. Across the room, Mark was still talking with a few guests near the bar. When he noticed us, he raised his glass. "To the only wedding where the slideshow fought back," he joked. That made the nearby tables laugh. The humor helped. It broke the last pieces of tension still hanging in the air. My mother-in-law stepped beside me again. "You know," she said softly, "most people spend years wishing someone would stand up for them like that." She nodded toward Daniel. "You married the right man." I smiled. "I know." Daniel overheard that part. "Good answer." he said. I nudged his arm lightly. You earned it tonight. He shook his head. No, then he looked around the room. You earned it years ago. That sentence made me pause. Because he wasn't talking about the video. He was talking about everything that came before it. The years of pressure. The quiet arguments. The endless conversations where my parents insisted the house belonged to the family. Even though Daniel and I had bought it ourselves. Even though it had nothing to do with them. For them it had never really been about the house. It had been about control. And tonight that control had finally broken. Jenna walked over again with 2 more glasses of champagne. You two should toast, she said. To what? I asked. She grinned. To surviving your own wedding. Daniel raised his glass. I'll drink to that. We clinked glasses lightly. Across the room the DJ called out. All right everyone, let's get the dance floor moving again. A few cheers followed. Daniel's cousins were already pulling people toward the center of the room. The energy had changed. Not forced. Just lighter. Like the room had decided something together. That the celebration mattered more than the drama. Richard returned to our table again. He glanced toward the door where my parents had left earlier. They won't come back tonight, he said calmly. Daniel nodded. I didn't think they would. Richard looked at me. You did the right thing. I wasn't sure how to answer that. Because the truth was I hadn't planned to do anything dramatic tonight. I had only planned to protect myself. And my marriage. Richard must have seen the uncertainty in my face. So he added one more thing. Standing your ground isn't cruelty. Then he lifted his glass slightly and walked back toward the dance floor. Daniel looked at me. You okay? Yes, I said. And this time I meant it. Because the strange thing about that moment was how peaceful it felt. Not triumphant. Not angry. Just finished. Across the room the cake was finally being cut. The caterer was slicing small pieces onto plates. Guests were lining up near the dessert table. Someone shouted, Save a slice for the bride. Daniel laughed. We should probably participate in our own reception. Good idea, I said. We walked toward the cake table together. People moved aside as we approached. Not awkwardly. Respectfully. A few guests smiled warmly. A couple of Daniel's co-workers gave him a quiet thumbs up. Jenna leaned toward me and whispered, You realize your wedding story is going to be legendary. I laughed softly. That wasn't exactly the goal. Well, she shrugged. You definitely achieved it. Daniel picked up the cake knife. Ready? I nodded. Together we cut the first slice. Applause broke out around the room. Not huge, but genuine. Because the celebration had finally reclaimed the night. Daniel handed me a small fork with a piece of cake. I took a bite. Vanilla and strawberries. The flavor felt surprisingly normal after everything that had just happened. Daniel leaned closer. You know what the best part is, he said. What? He glanced around the room. At the end of all that, he smiled slightly. We're still here. I looked around the vineyard hall again. The friends. The family who had stayed. The laughter slowly filling the room again. And he was right. The plan my parents had built had collapsed. But the wedding hadn't. If anything, the people who remained had made it stronger. By the time the cake was served, the vineyard hall looked like a wedding again. People were laughing. Music filled the space. And the tension that had frozen the room earlier had slowly melted into something softer. But even though the celebration had returned, everyone still remembered what had happened. Because some moments change the way a room feels forever. Daniel and I were standing near the dessert table when Jenna leaned over again. I'm still processing that speech your mom gave, she said quietly. I sighed. Technically it was more of a demand. That's putting it politely. Across the room, Mark was explaining the whole situation again to a few guests who had stepped outside earlier and missed the beginning of the drama. Every time he reached the part about the black clothing, people reacted the same way. Shock, confusion, then disbelief. Daniel noticed it too. Well, he said quietly, I guess your parents made a strong impression. That's one way to say it. He squeezed my hand gently. You okay talking about it? I thought for a second, then nodded. Yes, because something inside me had changed tonight. The pressure that had followed me for years suddenly felt lighter. Not gone completely, but finally exposed. And once something is exposed, it loses power. Daniel's mother returned with 2 plates of cake. She handed one to me. "You deserve to enjoy your own wedding dessert," she said warmly. "Thank you." She smiled. "You know something?" "What?" "I've been to a lot of weddings." I raised an eyebrow. "Good ones." "Oh yes." She paused. "But I've never seen a bride handle something like that with such calm." I laughed softly. "I wasn't calm. You looked calm." That made Daniel smile. "She practiced," he said. I nudged his arm. "I did not." He leaned closer and whispered, "Maybe not on purpose." That part was probably true, because growing up in my family had required a lot of quiet patience. Learning when to speak. Learning when not to. Learning when the only real answer was distance. Across the room the DJ had switched the music again. Now it was something upbeat. A few of Daniel's cousins had started dancing again near the center of the floor. Someone clapped along to the rhythm. Someone else cheered. The energy of the room was slowly rebuilding. But something about it felt different now. Stronger. Like the guests weren't just celebrating a wedding. They were celebrating what had survived it. Richard walked over again with his glass of champagne. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've seen business deals fall apart with less drama than that." Daniel laughed. "That's not very comforting." Richard shrugged. "I meant it as a compliment." He looked at me. "You stood your ground." I wasn't sure how to respond, because the truth was I hadn't stood alone. Daniel had stood beside me, and 40 witnesses had seen the truth when it mattered. Richard seemed to understand that. He raised his glass slightly. "To honesty," he said. Daniel clinked his glass against Richard's. "To honesty." Across the room he suddenly called out, "All right everyone, let's get the newlyweds back on the dance floor." Several guests cheered. Mark immediately pointed toward us. "There they are." Daniel groaned jokingly. "We've been discovered." I smiled. "Guess we have to dance again." He offered his hand. "Always." We walked back toward the center of the room. The same dance floor where the microphone had been just 30 minutes earlier. Now the screen behind the DJ booth was dark. The laptop closed. The drama finished. Daniel placed his hand at my waist again as the music began. Slow this time. Not our official first dance. Just something quiet. The kind of song people sway to when the evening starts settling. As we moved together under the soft lights, Daniel leaned close and said something quietly. "You know what I realized tonight?" "What?" He glanced around the room. The friends. The family who stayed. The laughter returning to every table. This wasn't the wedding your parents tried to ruin. I tilted my head slightly. "No." He smiled. "This was the wedding where everyone saw exactly who you are." The words landed gently, but they meant more than anything else that had happened that evening. Because my parents had come expecting to control the story. Instead, the truth had told it for them. The music slowed. The guests clapped softly again. And for the first time that night, the celebration felt completely real. Not interrupted. Not tense. Just honest. Daniel squeezed my hand one more time. "Ready for the rest of our life?" he asked. I smiled back. "After tonight?" I laughed softly. "I think we can handle anything." By the time the final song of the night began, the vineyard had grown quieter. Not empty, just calmer. The kind of calm that happens when a long evening finally starts settling into memory. Some guests were sitting back in their chairs finishing the last of their drinks. Others stood in small groups near the tables, talking softly, laughing occasionally. The candles along the tables had burned low. The warm light strung across the wooden beams gave the whole room a soft golden glow. Daniel and I had stepped outside for a moment. The cool evening air felt good after everything that had happened inside. The vineyard stretched quietly beyond the reception hall, rows of vines disappearing into the dark hillside. For the first time all day, the night felt peaceful. Daniel leaned against the wooden railing beside me. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded slowly. "Yes." And this time the answer felt completely true. Not the kind of okay people say to keep a conversation moving. The real kind. Because something important had happened that night. Not just the wedding. Something else. For years my parents had controlled the narrative of our family. The expectations. The guilt. The quiet pressure to do things their way. But tonight that story had changed. Not because we fought them. Not because we embarrassed them. But because the truth had been heard out loud. And once people hear the truth, it's very hard to pretend it doesn't exist. Daniel looked out over the vineyard. You know, he said, this probably wasn't the wedding your parents imagined. I laughed softly. No, he smiled slightly. But it might have been the wedding you needed. That made me pause. Because he was right. Growing up, I had always imagined my wedding day as a moment where everything came together. Family, support, celebration. Instead, it had revealed something else. Who was actually standing beside me, and who wasn't. Behind us, the doors of the reception hall opened again. Jenna stepped outside with 2 glasses of champagne. I thought you two might have escaped, she said. Just catching some air, I replied. She handed 1 glass to me and 1 to Daniel. Well, she said, raising her glass slightly, to the strongest bride I've ever seen. Daniel clinked his glass gently against mine. I'll second that. I shook my head, smiling. You're both exaggerating. Jenna laughed. No, we're not. She nodded toward the hall behind us. You know what everyone inside is saying right now? What? That they've never seen someone handle something like that with so much dignity. The word lingered in my mind. Dignity. I hadn't been thinking about that earlier. I had only been thinking about protecting what Daniel and I had built. Our home. Our future. Our marriage. But maybe that was the same thing. After a moment, Jenna went back inside, leaving Daniel and me alone again. The music drifted softly through the open doors. Someone inside cheered as another song started. Daniel finished his drink and set the empty glass on the railing. So, he said. So, ready to go back in and enjoy the rest of our wedding. I looked toward the hall. Through the open doors I could see our friends laughing at the tables. Daniel's parents talking warmly with guests. The dance floor filling again. The celebration continuing. And the strange thing was, felt stronger now. Because the people inside that room had made a choice. They stayed. They celebrated. They stood with us. I reached for Daniel's hand. Yes, I said. I am. We walked back into the reception hall together. The DJ spotted us immediately. There they are, he called out. A small cheer spread across the room. Not loud. Just warm. The kind of cheer that feels like a room full of people quietly rooting for you. Daniel pulled me back onto the dance floor. The music slowed again. And as we began to dance, I glanced once toward the entrance of the hall. The door where my parents had walked out earlier. They never came back. And for the first time in my life, that didn't feel like a loss. Felt like clarity. Daniel leaned close as the music played softly around us. You know something, he said. What? He smiled. Your parents came here dressed for a funeral. I nodded. They did. But they were wrong about what was ending tonight. I looked around the room. At the people still celebrating. At the life Daniel and I were starting together. And I realized he was right. Something had ended that night. But it wasn't my happiness. It was the power my parents thought they still had over it. The song came to a gentle end. Applause filled the room again. Daniel squeezed my hand. And as the music started again and the celebration continued around us, one simple truth settled quietly in my mind. My parents had come to my wedding to take something from me. Instead, they watched me begin a life they could no longer control.